Welcome, everyone. Are you all able to hear me?
Yes, you are
Thank you.
heard.
Thank you. Thank you, Cassandra. My name is Araceli Estrada. I am a program assistant with the Center for Health Equity Transformation. And today we bring you the CHETchat Spotlight series. And we are featuring Professor Mary Pattillo on the impacts of fines and fees in the criminal justice system. Before we get started, here are a few housekeeping items. Feel free to submit any questions you have during the event. This should be a pretty brief presentation, so we are encouraging lots of questions and participation from the audience. So feel free to drop any questions you might have in the Q&A box. So if you see the Zoom toolbox, right in the center, you have a Q&A icon. Another feature you can use is the raise hand feature. If you open the participants box, you should be able to raise your hand. But if not, feel free to use the Q&A box and we will get to your questions during that portion. Another announcement is that we have our podcast Skinny Trees released a new episode this morning, and we interview Jose Lopez on Humboldt Park, Puerto Rican culture and identity in Chicago. So please check it out. Someone from the chat team will drop a link to that SoundCloud episode, but you can always find us at skinnytreespodcast.com. So check it out. It's a pretty good podcast. Today we have Professor Mary Pattillo. Mary Pattillo is chair of the Department of African American Studies and Harold Washington Professor of Sociology and African American Studies at Northwestern University. She is the author of the 2 award-winning books, Black Picket Fences, Privilege and Peril Among Black Middle Class, and Black on the Block, The Politics of Race and Class in the City, and has published in the American Sociological Review, Social Forces, the Du Bois Review, among other journals. She was elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in 2020. Welcome, Professor Patillo. I'm going to hand it off to you to get started.
Thank you so much, Araceli, for organizing today's talk. I'm going to, and hello to everyone, although I guess I can't see everyone, huh? I only get to see you Araceli, right?
Yeah, the webinar feature.
Got it. Okay, like well, hello to everyone out there. So I'm going to share my screen. So as Araceli mentioned, I'll be talking about the impacts of fines and fees in the criminal legal system. I'm really trying to train myself to use this term criminal legal system as opposed to criminal justice system, because the more I study it and the more I work in it through the Northwestern Prison Education Program, the more I see how little justice there is in the criminal legal system. So I'm going to start off with something that I've never used. I had, before doing this research, I had never had a picture of Clarence Thomas to begin a lecture of mine. And this is regarding a 2019 decision where he was on the same side as the other justices in finding that in a case in Indiana that the person had been subjected to excessive fines. And he used this quite archaic language, quoted a finding from 1600s England about how the court in that period had been using excessive fines to disproportionately harm their enemies. And at that time, that their enemies were the Protestants. So they were favoring papists and persons popishly affected and excessively oppressing His Majesty's Protestant subjects. So I thought this language was interesting because it very much connected to a similar kind of reaching back in history that a person we interviewed here in Illinois in 2017, a 16-year-old man who had fines and fees to pay. And he told us, give Caesar what's due. Why should we pay Caesar? Whose face is on the money? Caesar. Then you pay Caesar what's due. Again, reaching even further back in this case, this man had been sentenced to pay over $5,000 in court costs, fines, and fees for various felonies and misdemeanors, all of which were drug and traffic related, no violent felonies or misdemeanors. He was homeless and reported a total monthly income of $192 in food stamps. So we ask, is this excessive as well? The Supreme Court decision was particularly about forfeitures, which I'll just mention a little bit later, but it has not yet ruled and has not yet considered how to think about fees, especially as being a part of what the Constitution covers in this excessive fines and fees clause. So what I'm going to talk about today is a relatively narrow question about justice, but we've been writing a number of papers. I say we, my research assistant Gabriella Kirk and I here in Illinois, as part of a much bigger research project in 8 states across the country. We've been studying fines and fees, and I'll talk about that a little bit more towards the end. But for today, I'm just going to focus on this question: do monetary sanctions as practiced in the courts satisfy or betray important forms of justice, retributive, procedural, distributive, and constitutional, which I'll define after I define what am I talking about? What are monetary sanctions? So we know about mass incarceration. We know that the United States incarcerates more people than any other country in the world. And that's just incarceration. And then in addition to incarceration, there's a whole probation system that adds, if incarceration is about 1.7 million, probation adds about 3+ million people on probation, so also under court supervision. And most of those people on probation and many of those people who will come out of jails and prisons will owe monetary sanctions. So it is the financial part of a person sentenced. Most felony and misdemeanor sentences come with fines, fees, and other monetary sanctions that I'll mention. So this shows you the Illinois law that requires a minimum fine, unless otherwise specified by law, of $25. And this is just to show you kind of what it looks like in law. In Illinois, we recently changed the law in 2018. The Criminal Traffic Assessments Act has a schedule of everything that it calls assessments. So they used to be called costs and fees, and now we've standardized the language to be assessments. And this gives you a sense of these kinds of assessments. So for generic felony offenses, all of these things are part of this assessment. $354 goes to the county treasurer, and then it tells you exactly where it goes. $20 to the court automation fund, $20 to the court document storage fund. And people in this field often call these user fees. People who have been who have been convicted of misdemeanors, felonies, and traffic crimes end up paying for the courts. So it's a way to pay for courts that doesn't pull from all of our, that despite the fact that all of us should be paying for the courts, this is an idea that those who are in the court system, the defendants, should pay for it. This is what the Criminal Traffic and Assessments Act looks like, and it basically shows you the various kinds of crimes that occasion these assessments, from arson to DUIs to construction zone speeding to a number of various things that I can talk about in the Q&A if you're interested. And then this is how it shows up for a defendant. So this person was found guilty of a drug crime, and this is the accounting, the bill for the defendant, where this defendant has a $185 fine, and $80 will go to pay for the clerk's office, $40 to the state's attorney's office, $52 to the sheriff's office, and on and on and on. So you see how this shows up for the defendant. In addition to fines and fees and assessments, there are a number of other court costs that aren't part of that Criminal Traffic Assessments Act that I talked about. So if you don't pay your court costs and assessments on time, you can be assessed interest and you can be assessed penalties. There's restitution, which goes to the victim. So if there was a theft, for example, there might be restitution in the amount of that theft. There are costs for court-mandated programs. So in a domestic violence case, for example, the person might be required to take anger management courses, which cost money, and they must pay for those. They might have to pay for, if they're sentenced to be on house arrest with a GPS ankle monitor, they might have to pay for that. If they're in drug counseling, they will have to pay for that. Traffic management courses, and on and on. Forfeiture, as I mentioned, comes even before you're sentenced. So in the Supreme Court case, the person was a first-time drug dealer who had a car, a Range Rover, that was worth $40,000, and it was forfeited, despite the fact that the maximum fine for his crime was, I think, something like $5,000. So that's why this was ruled to be excessive, but you can forfeit property if it's supposedly either the benefits from or used in the commission of a crime. And then there's bail, which is pre-conviction, like forfeiture, which Illinois and Cook County is trying to do away with money bail, but in very even low-level offenses, you can have $1,000 bail, which means you have to come up with 10%. And if you can't come up with it, then you sit in jail even before your any kind of court appearance. And the research is very clear that people who come before the court while they're in jail fare less well in terms of sentencing than people who are out on bail. So we see how money or the lack thereof disadvantages folks who have to sit in jail waiting for their trial date or waiting for their usually it's a plea agreement, waiting for that plea agreement. In Illinois, 98% of all cases include some fines or fees. Or restitution. So it is ubiquitous. If you have a case before the courts, you are going to have a monetary sanction. And this is the median order for fines and fees and restitution in various kinds of cases. So $1,350 for felony cases, a little over $700 for misdemeanor cases, and $656 for, this is likely, includes a number of traffic cases as well, the other category. And then finally, some of you all might have heard about this in the news more generally. It's not something that usually makes the news, but there was a case in Florida where the state of Florida, through a ballot referendum, re-enfranchised or enfranchised, gave the vote to people who had committed felony offenses, had done their prison time, and now were out. Every state decides how to treat convicted felons who have now served their sentence. So in the state of Illinois, ex-felons were going to be able to vote. And then, per the ballot initiative that passed across the whole state, then the legislature decided to pull back on that and to say only former felons who have paid off all of their monetary sanctions can vote. And this basically disenfranchised thousands of former felons in the state of Florida, partially because people are too poor to pay, but also partially because the record keeping in Florida was so bad that people didn't even know they had to pay or how much they had to pay. This is also the case in Illinois with many of the people that we interviewed, that they were unclear about how much they had to pay. So these are just some headlines. It made further headlines when Michael Bloomberg gave $16 million to a fund as nonprofit organizations are trying to pay off the monetary sanctions of former felons so that they're able to vote in this in the upcoming election. All right, so now we all know what monetary sanctions are. Let's talk a little bit about the kinds of justice I'll be talking about. Retributive justice is the idea that punishment is the just response to an offense. So basically you did something bad, and so there should be some punishment. But one of the key philosophies of retributive justice is that it should be proportional to the crime. So that's a question that we ask when we do this research. Is it proportional to the crime? Procedural justice asks if the procedure in the court followed the law and if the person perceived the players, the actors, the process to be just. Distributive justice is about the fairness of the distribution of resources and the allocation of rights, responsibilities, costs, and burdens. Since this is a monetary sanction, we can think about who is paying for things, and is that a just distribution of the burdens and of the costs of the criminal justice system? And then constitutional justice obviously asks if a practice aligns with constitutional edicts, and in this particular case, if monetary sanctions can be deemed to be excessive. We've done this research, we've collected, we've done interviews across the whole state of Illinois, 68 interviews in 8 counties across Illinois with people paying their court debt, 87 interviews across the state of Illinois with court personnel, with judges, prosecutors, defense attorneys, probation officers, and court clerks, 240 hours of courtroom observations across the state, and a detailed analysis of both the previous laws prior to the Criminal Traffic and Assessments Act, and so the current law, which is the CTAA, and the previous laws before that, many of which have to do with fines and fees and stay on the book. The CTAA just standardized the amounts of the fines and fees. It's important to get a sense of who is it that is being sentenced to pay this court debt. So to pay these court fines and fees. Our interviewees were about half and half men and women. That's partially because women are just as equally represented in traffic court. Disproportionately Black given the state population, and that's not surprising given the over-policing of Black communities and the various racisms in the criminal legal system that we are talking about during this season of the one book, which is, the one book is Just Mercy. Disproportionately low income, 59% have incomes below $1,500 a month, and disproportionately sentenced to non-violent crimes. So there are many figures here at the bottom about their criminal case, but only 26% were sentenced for violent felonies or misdemeanors, which means 74% were for non-violent felonies or misdemeanors. And I'll also point out that 84% had served some jail or prison time. This leads to many people feeling like the fines and fees are really double punishment. So we found that I'm focusing on the interviews with people paying their court debt, and I'll talk a little, just mention some things about the other parts of our data later. That first people thought that fines and fees were justifiable punishment, that they had done something wrong and they understood there had to be some punishment. And so in that regard, they weren't thinking initially that there was really a breach of retributive justice. But because of their low incomes, many found it impossible to pay the fines and fees. And so it was a breach of retributive justice because it was excessive given their means. And that excessiveness feeds into this constitutional justice, which I'll talk about. They found it to be double punishment. They had spent time in jail and prison and still had to pay money. So they found it was disproportionate to their crime and excessive. They felt it breached procedural justice by feeling like extortion, which I'll talk about. They found it unclear as to where the money was going and that it was collected by a greedy state. So this breached both their sense of procedural justice and distributive justice. So the ones in red are the ones I'm going to have not too much time to talk about, but I'll just give a little bit of evidence for the ones in red. So first, too poor to pay. It's important to remember that figure that I mentioned, that 59% of folks earned under $1,500 a month, sorry. And that gives you a sense of how even small amounts of fines and fees can be too much to pay. For example, one person we interviewed said, it's $50 a month. That's expensive. No one has that kind of money when you're coming out of jail. Again, $50 a month may not seem like a lot, and that's why in another paper we call this statutory inequality, because those of us who can pay $50 a month without any problem are immediately don't have that extra surveillance and additional punishment, whereas those who can't pay it do. And so that creates inequality per the statutes, just given the means of the people who are convicted of the same crime. So the punishment is different, even though the crime is the same. Two women in downstate Illinois, both of whom had misdemeanor convictions, and both reported less than $500 a month in income, mentioned how paying their monetary sanctions competed with their responsibilities as mothers. One said, it's a strain on me. I can't get things I need for my kids because I'm thinking, oh shoot, wait, I gotta pay this fine. It's like they taking all my money, you know what I mean? And then her friend added more detail. She said, now it's affected me really bad. School's about to start back. He does a lot of sports and stuff. Who's going to do all of that? I can't afford that. I'm just like, oh, please let this judge have mercy on me on the 15th when I go. I'm not no troublemaker. You know I'm not no troublemaker. So just give me $25 a month. I can pay that. Several respondents, for example, that we interviewed detailed their monthly accounting. A 50-year-old transgendered Latina woman in Chicago who had fines and fees of over $1,000 a month, $1,000, told us, quote, I live out of $720 a month. With that, I manage to pay rent, pay phone, pay light. I do get Link, which is the Illinois food stamps card, but you can't buy what you need with the Link. Sometimes you're just in need of deodorant. So she was making $720 a month and had a $1,000 fine, which obviously was not payable. To talk about, so it's important to recognize that the people we interviewed thought there was some retributive justice in fines and fees, but that it was excessive. One woman, a 42-year-old Black woman in Chicago, said, clearly we're low income. I know that it's a form of punishment. However, it doesn't make a means to the end. It's just none of this makes sense to me. Again, giving you a sense how it breaches her sense of justice and how it could be seen as excessive, given the fact that for many people, their fines and fees were more than their total monthly income. So thinking about proportionality, thinking about proportionality both for retributive and for constitutional justice, for many people that we interviewed, these fines and fees were excessive and disproportionate. I'll move now to the second point, this idea of extortion. And I want to show a little bit of the law here in Illinois, where it states an offender who defaults in the payment of a fine or any installment of that fine may be held in contempt and imprisoned for non-payment. Going on to section B, unless the offender shows that his default was not due to his intentional refusal to pay or not due to a failure on his part to make a good effort to pay, the court may order the offender imprisoned for a term not to exceed 6 months if the fine was for a felony, or 30 days if the fine was for a misdemeanor, and so on. So this is the law that basically says you can be imprisoned if you can't pay, if you don't pay. And that second part, unless the offender shows that his default was not due to his intentional refusal to pay, requires a hearing to determine if non-payment was willful, which is another language way that it's talked about in the statutes, whether that non-payment was willful or not. And that hearing must be held before somebody can be imprisoned. Both the Illinois Constitution and the Supreme Court, in a ruling Bearden versus Georgia in 1983, prohibit imprisonment for non-payment without first holding that hearing to find out if non-payment was willful. These laws, however, don't stop state's attorneys, judges, and probation officers from both scaring people and actually imprisoning people without having a hearing here in Illinois and across the country. The threat of incarceration and other punishments, such as extending probation or sending bills to credit reporting agencies or terminating probation unsuccessfully, constituted strong breaches of both procedural justice for the people that not for both, but for procedural justice for the people that we spoke to. And we saw this both in our interviews and in our courtroom observations. It was quite, these threats were quite frequent. For example, one 29-year-old said, yeah, they have me on unsupervised probation. Then they put me back on unsupervised probation because my fine wasn't paid off. What do they expect? I'm moving out of public housing, no income, with 3 kids, and I'm pregnant now. So for this woman, the breach of procedural justice is evident in her rhetorical question, what do they expect? This was in a small place in Illinois where her probation officer knew that her public housing was being closed down and that she had to find a place to move. She reported income of less than $500 per month, and it seemed ridiculous to her that they would even expect her to pay. These expectations of the court violated her sense of procedural justice. She went on to say, they told me when I went to court that if I didn't have $607, that they were going to try to send me to jail. I was like, can we work out a payment plan? And the judge responded, oh no, it's been a year. You should have been paid that. That's what the judge told me. He told me I had to pay something. With that threat, the woman paid $100. And the interviewer asked, but you know, he knows you don't have a source of income. And she said, he don't care. So again, for her, procedural justice would require some level of care, some human acknowledgement of her financial situation. It was unclear where she got the $100 to pay that day, but her motivation to pay was clear. She said, it makes me want to go in a rush and pay my fine so I won't lose my kids. And we asked her, are you in danger of losing your kids? And she said, no, not through the Department of Children and Family Services, no. But if I go to jail, yes. So jail is punishment enough and threat enough, but it's a special threat for a single mother with few social supports. Paying the $100 was the direct response and result of that threat of jail, which meant for her being unable to care for her children. So to summarize, monetary sanctions for poor and near poor people are frequently excessive because they're often disproportionate to the crime and go beyond a defendant's ability to pay. Monetary sanctions breach retributive, procedural, and distributive justice. I wasn't able to get into the distributive justice examples, but I can do some of that in the Q&A if folks are interested. Just to give a sense of other impacts and other research on monetary sanctions, the research shows how the dollar amounts of these monetary sanctions have been increasing over the last 3 to 4 decades. The research shows how people struggle to pay their court debt, making it difficult to pay life essentials. I highlight here housing because another paper that we're working on is how there's this circular cycle of getting monetary sanctions, being unable to pay, which destabilizes people's housing, which puts them into situations of homelessness at times. Homelessness then is criminalized, and they find themselves back into the criminal justice system with more fines and fees. Monetary sanctions prolong criminal justice supervision, which we have termed layaway freedom, as people go on installment plans to try to pay off these fines and fees, which judges often then extend beyond the initial probation period because people haven't been able to pay off their fines and fees. And the research shows that monetary sanctions have racially disparate impacts and are also that, for example, the state of Washington, which is one of our key states, have found higher amounts of monetary sanctions in Black neighborhoods in particular. I'll just end with one quote. A 36-year-old Black man in downstate Illinois summed up his theory of the excesses of monetary sanctions. He said, "I don't get this place down here as far as their judicial system. They are just wicked." So we started with kings in 1600s England, and we went to emperors, as our interviewee talked about Caesar, and we end with wickedness. And these are not the kinds of images and representations of a modern criminal justice system. And thus, when you take the perspective of people paying these monetary sanctions, it leads to a policy proposal to eliminate such sanctions because of their lack of alignment with various forms of justice. And I'll stop there, and hopefully we have plenty of time for Q&A.
Thank you so much, Professor Patillo. I do see a question that popped up in the chat box.
Okay, yep, so let me open my chat. Are there ways, I'll read it out loud, so I'll read it to myself. Are there ways to get involved with, support your incredible work? Thank you. Perhaps through community organizations you're connected to or directly volunteering with. I'm extremely interested in this sort of research. Thank you so much for the question. I would say actually here in Illinois, if you're interested, before I go to here in Illinois, I think the most pressing thing right now is Florida. I mean, Florida is a swing state. So I would look up that nonprofit. I mean, they have a big infusion of cash through Bloomberg, but I can't remember the estimate they say, but his money will not satisfy all the fines and fees. So looking up what's going on in Florida, seeing how much time is left before the work that they're doing, that they can't do it anymore for this particular election, although many elections, this will be relevant for many elections to come. So I think though for this election, focusing on Florida is super important, although I guess I just betrayed my political leanings. But here in Illinois, there aren't such funds for people paying fines and fees. And that's an interesting point that I guess there could be such funds. One organization that I'm working with is the Chicago Appleseed Fund for Justice. It has been at the forefront of activities to do research on fines and fees, to do policy briefs, to work with the criminal. It was at the forefront of providing evidence for the Criminal Traffic and Assessment Act. One of the important things of this new act, in addition to making things a little bit more transparent and standardized, because it had been really a willy-nilly across the state, very uneven across the state, but most important, it has created waivers for people up to 400% of the poverty line. There's still work to be done because it's not retroactive. And so all the people we interviewed who still have fines and fees still have to pay. So that's one new front that Chicago Appleseed is working on. So we need to make it retroactive. We need to make sure that it's being practiced because people have to apply for these waivers. It's not automatically granted. So we need to make sure that public defenders are aware of this and get people to apply, that probation officers are aware of this and get people to apply, and that these waivers are being granted because it takes an application and the judge needs to grant them. So there's still a lot of activism and advocacy work that needs to happen, and Chicago Appleseed is doing really a lot of that. On the front end, the Chicago Community Bond Fund is a really important organization so that people aren't sitting in jail waiting for their case to come before the judge just because they're poor. As you all know, perhaps, the police officer charged in the death of George Floyd in Minneapolis has paid the $1 million bond and is now even able to leave the state of Minnesota, whereas anybody who doesn't have collateral, isn't a homeowner, won't be able to pay that and will sit in jail until their case. And that's a violent crime. We have people sitting in jail here in Illinois for nonviolent crimes. So the Chicago Community Bond Fund is another place for pretrial justice.
I see a question in the Q&A box. Actually, two questions that are a little similar.
Oh, I didn't even see that. Okay, let me open that up. Okay, are there any reforms to abolish monetary sanctions? If so, what do people change, and is it so successful so far? So no state that I know of in the country has eliminated monetary sanctions, partially because it will require a very different way of thinking about funding the courts. Chicago Appleseed is working, again, in this direction. The first legislation was part of that. The Brennan Center for Justice at NYU has done a really important report on the fact that these fines and fees may not actually even clear how much they cost to try to collect them. So because so many people are poor, collecting them is very difficult. And so they get sent to, first of all, the clerks spend a lot of their time trying to collect them. In our courtroom observations, we spent time in the Cook County courts where a whole courtroom was devoted to defendants coming before the judge and the judge saying, how much are you going to pay today? This does not seem like a very cost-efficient way to spend a high-paying judge's time. So this Brennan Institute report has shown that in many places, it may not even be cost-effective to have these fines and fees because collection costs outweigh how much they get in revenue. So we need this kind of advocacy to show these kinds of things and to move towards that elimination. I would say the research on this topic really started to take off just in the last 10 to 15 years. And so, you know, we're really starting to get the evidence base to make the case in state capitals. But then we have to think about where the revenue source will be. And that gets to this point that I was making about distributive justice, that this funding the court supposedly on the backs of the poorest among us, those who are in the criminal justice system and who are sometimes there for crimes of poverty, is a regressive form of a tax. So if someone in the criminal justice system has to pay a $1,000 fine and their whole income for the year is $20,000, as opposed to if I have to increase my taxes, since it will be spread over all of the people in Illinois by, let's call it $5 out of my salary, that's a much smaller proportion of my salary, which makes it a much more progressive kind of tax. But I also think that part of the road towards eliminating monetary sanctions is shrinking the criminal legal system overall, which comes in part by shrinking our policing. Because, for example, in Cook County, the Cook County State's Attorney has decided not to prosecute various kinds of driving offenses that came about because people hadn't paid fines and fees. So people might be driving on a suspended license because their license was suspended because they didn't pay parking tickets, for example. So Kim Foxx has decided not to prosecute these cases. But that doesn't mean the police aren't still arresting people, ticketing people, sending people to the Cook County courts for driving on a suspended license. So we have the policing still doing this work that's making more work in the courts with all of those salaries, prosecutors, defense attorneys, judges, and so on. And if we coordinated better so as not to bring these to the courts at all, we wouldn't even have those costs. So I think the policing end is super key for getting us to eliminating these fines and fees. I think I kind of answered that second question too. What would need to happen to eliminate these fines and fees?
Yes. I have a question here that I see from the team. What are other countries with less percentage of population incarcerated doing right? Or is it a result of the unique American population?
That's an interesting question, because I am assuming that in that question, the person is gesturing when they say the unique American population, that our diversity might be part of our over-incarceration, and that basically our legacy, our history of racism, our anti-Black racism, our anti-immigrant stances, contemporary anti-immigrant stances, is part of this over-incarceration. And I have not seen precise research on looking at how racial diversity correlates with with the incarceration rate. So I can't say that I've seen research. There could be research out there. I can't say that I've seen it, but that strikes me as a reasonable hypothesis. On this particular issue of fines and fees, most European countries have a sliding scale for fines and fees, so that they're much more calibrated to a person's income, which means many of the people that we interviewed would likely have no fines and fees. But there's been some early research out of Germany that suggests nonetheless similar kinds of practices happen, meaning the court calibrates it to people's incomes, but it's still exorbitant to the person, and it does lead to continuing surveillance and supervision under the criminal justice system. So I've seen some European researchers still pushing against even the sliding scale fines and fees that they have there, especially for the lowest income populations. And they also find this disproportionate use on communities of color in Germany, in France, for example. So on immigrant populations, and for low level of offenses like jumping the turnstile for public transportation. So crimes that might be crimes of poverty then get disproportionately criminalized. So I think that question is pointing in the right direction. It's going to make me look to see if there are any real papers on that topic. Then the question also asked more generally about mass incarceration. Our mass incarceration, yes, is partially this legacy of racism, and also our very, very heavy criminalization of drug crimes coming out of the war on drugs in the 1980s, and laws about 3 strikes. So it's both that we give longer sentences, we give sentences for smaller infractions, which means more people are staying in jails longer, which increases our prison population. We also have very high recidivism rates because our prisons are not at all restorative, not at all rehabilitative, which leads to recidivism. I see a question. Could you speak to the issue of criminalizing mental health and the costs involved with Cook County Jail having to provide mental health services? The question has, yes, the answer in it. This is not my area of expertise, other than to say in this paper that I am doing on housing and the criminal justice system, basically in our interviews in Illinois, about half of the people we interviewed had some history of homelessness. Across all of the 8 states, that percentage was about 45% had some history of homelessness. And then so there are multiple additional issues that go along with homelessness, one of which is mental health. Substance abuse is another. And in those interviews, we found it very clear how there is this cycle of mental health problems and substance abuse and being ensnared in the criminal justice system. It's not a topic that I have really good statistics on because it wasn't the focus of this research, but there's no question. There's a new book coming out called Redistributing the Poor, which is about the relationship between, it's on Los Angeles. It's about the relationship between the LA County Jail and the LA Public Hospital, and basically how the two institutions just trade inmates and patients depending on which funding source is getting the most attention in public policy at that moment. So yeah, there's lots of research on this question, and it's really a real travesty that basically our mental health system is our jail system. On restorative justice models, again, it's really not the topic of this particular research. I've seen it more in terms of the research in schools, because one of the there's a lot of clear evidence that we have this school to prison pipeline where the criminalization of young people in schools gets them early involved in the juvenile justice system, juvenile legal system, and which is then a precursor to, there's no restoration in the juvenile legal system, which then leads to offending later on. But restorative justice models in schools is one place that I've seen a lot of positive results. There are a number of, there's an organization called ASA, Academy for Scholastic Achievement on the West Side, that I've seen use it to very positive effect, for example. But in the prison system, I don't know. One thing I will say, the Northwestern Prison Education Program is building off of the very clear research on how prison education is part of that rehabilitative and restorative process and leads to much lower recidivism. So we are building on that evidence in our own work, but that's a very clear finding across the country. So I see this question. You mentioned the high costs and the ineffective court system overall. Why is the criminal legal system so convoluted and hard to be reformed overall? Is this also a legacy of racism? That's a great question. I'm not sure I can say that our court system is the legacy of racism, although I will definitely say that it's that within it you see the real operation of racism. One of our former PhD students, now a professor at Brown, Nicole Gonzalez Van Cleve, has a book called Cook County, which is the best in-depth ethnography of the Cook County court system that exists. And she highlights the daily racism from the judges, prosecutors, and even the defense attorneys. Their labeling of defendants, their how the courts, how the architecture of the courts and the layout of the courts creates a stigma for the disproportionate Black and Latinx defendants who come into the courts through how basically the white workers and lawyers get to go through the metal detectors while Black and Latinx people form lines around the corner that contribute to that stigma. It is very clear on that racism in the court system. I'm not sure it's about the legacy of slavery and racism as opposed to it currently surely upholding and reproducing that racism. Another really important book for those of you all who don't want to be so Chicago-centered, Misdemeanor Land, who the author is Isa Kohler-Hausman, about the processing of misdemeanor crimes in the New York criminal justice system. So I will say that that this disproportionate processing of Black and Latinx, and it's really much more anti-Black than anti-Latinx. The Latinx folks are definitely overrepresented in the criminal legal system, but not nearly to the extent of Black folks. And where the issue for Latinx folks when it comes to the criminal legal system is especially in the immigration, the kind of not just deportation, but also immigration, prisons, and so on and so forth. So that's really where Latinx folks, but this over prosecution and over supervision and over surveillance of misdemeanor crimes, as told in Misdemeanor Land, is part of this over policing of Black and Latinx neighborhoods. So we know that stop and frisk disproportionately subjected Black and Latinx people to these stops and searches, and that results in this over policing. So things that white people are basically getting away with, Black and Latinx folks are not. And you know, if that kind of policing came to a predominantly white affluent community, it would, I'm sure, be immediately contested. But because it happens invisibly to Black and Latinx folks, it is maintained. So in that regard, I would say, since the courts are processing what our police system does, that is, I think, a part of that ongoing reproduction of racism.
I have another question here. To what extent are interest rates charged on past due fines and fees? And how does that add as an unjust burden?
So the law authorizes, it's a graduated interest rate. I think it starts at 9% and it tops out at, I think, 30%. So the statutes authorize interest on past due fines and fees. In our interviews here in Illinois with court actors, with clerks especially, few of them said that they tack on the interest. But when they send the past due fines and fees to the collection agencies, there is a 30% premium that's tacked on there. So past due interest isn't as common as collection fee, the additional 30% tacked on for collection fees. But that's just Illinois. Across the country, in our 8-state study, many of the other states very much charge this additional interest. And we only did our interviews in 8 counties in Illinois, and in working with Chicago Appleseed, this has definitely been a concern of many of the people as part of this task force, that other counties in Illinois are charging the interest, and they can. Again, it's statutorily authorized, so they're able to do this. There was a second part to the question, I thought. So to what extent are people tacking on the interest, and
how does this add as an unjust burden?
Right. Well, I mean, if folks can't pay the first fine or fee, they're unlikely to pay the additional interest. And where the burden comes in addition to having your having it sent to a collection agencies and all of the possible credit ramifications that has, when they're not sent to collection agencies, they can lead to this, as I mentioned, extension of supervision. So what was a 1-year probation term could turn into a 18-month probation term or a 24-month probation term, which requires monthly reporting, for example, going to the court, which of course is transportation and taking off work and possible childcare and to go there only to possibly say, I can't pay the $50 this month. And if you don't go because you know you can't pay, if you don't show up, a warrant for your arrest can immediately be put out by the judge, in which case if you're pulled over for some other reason, you can be put in jail that day. So say you're pulled over for going 10 miles over the speed limit, which otherwise would not get you imprisoned. If there's a warrant because you didn't show up for that court date, which was a court date just to pay $50, which you could not pay, then you're in jail for speeding over 10 miles an hour. Again, the point I want to emphasize is how unequal the punishment is for similar crimes, because any one of these crimes, any domestic violence crime for a professional, for example, who can easily pay their fines and fees, is satisfied, whereas a domestic violence crime for someone who can't pay cannot be satisfied, and thus the punishment is different despite similar crime. You mentioned that in some places ex-felons don't know how much fees they need to pay. Why is the record so messed up? What can the government possibly gain by keeping a messy record? Yes, so this is very much related to something I'm teaching right now in my urban sociology class, which is about geographic fragmentation across the country. So first of all of the things we've been talking about are extremely localized. So here in the state of Illinois, we have a unified court system, which means we have county courts that feed up to a circuit court system, which is somewhat standardized. But before the Criminal and Traffic Assessment Act, every county has its own record keeping for all of the things that we're talking about. And the centralized repository doesn't require the fines and fees to be reported. So for example, when we got the state level data for this for our research project, much of the information on fines and fees was missing. They have to report jail sentences and so on and so forth. So it happens all at the county level. Every county can decide who they're going to contract with for their database systems, who they're going to contract with for their collections, how they're going to keep their records. When we first started this research 5 years ago, the fines and fees schedule for some of the smaller counties, some of these counties are, just tens of thousands of people, the fines and fees, how much you have to pay, was handwritten in a ledger. So each county decides how it's going to do its record keeping, and as a result, it's not all computerized. In Cook County, there's no way to go online to find out how much you owe. Just in the last 2 years, the Cook County clerk has started to get computerized. If you go into any court system, what you will see are lawyers pushing push carts of dozens of manila folders of paper. And that leads to people not knowing how much they owe across the state of Illinois. And Illinois is not the worst case scenario because we have a unified court system. In Missouri, for example, where there are hundreds of municipal courts, which is when this also got a lot of attention because Ferguson was one of those courts that was building much of its revenue off of fines and fees. Hundreds of municipal courts, you can have fines and fees owed in dozens of them, which the US Department of Justice found was the case, and thus not even know you owe something.
Thank you so much, Professor Patillo, and for everyone that submitted questions. If we don't have any more questions, I'll leave it open to you, Professor Patillo, if you want to leave anyone with any remarks or action items that they can do if they want to be a little bit more involved in this kind of work. I see, actually,
Yeah, one question, how has your research influenced your ideas about equity and freedom that are the foundational values of the US? Thank you so much, because this paper that I mentioned that we entitled Layaway Freedom, I've been thinking a lot about freedom. You know, it totally illustrates how in the criminal legal system, we surely can't think of freedom as just being outside of jail or prison. So the graduate student I've been working with, Gabriella Kirk, is doing her dissertation on ankle monitoring. And basically one of her papers argues that the people she interviewed who are on ankle monitoring are grateful for being on ankle monitoring because they're not in the Cook County jail. But that gratefulness is simply because our sense of freedom has gotten so curtailed to think that jail is our only alternative, that you're then thankful for being on GPS monitoring for a very low level crime that 20 years ago wouldn't have even required that. So what unfortunately has happened in this era of mass incarceration is that our imagination has gotten so stunted that we think being on ankle monitoring is freedom, or we think that not having to be in jail but instead just having to pay fines and fees is freedom. But for the people that I've interviewed, real freedom, you have to be done with supervision, you have to be free of these debts, and you know, we have to start thinking more expansively about being free of this supervision overall. Oh, you had said any, so I'll just repeat: Chicago Appleseed, Cook County Bond Fund, all of the protest organizations that are BYP 100 that are in the front lines of pushing us toward an abolitionist imagination. Yeah, I will. And of course, here at Northwestern, folks are doing amazing work around juvenile justice, getting rid of juvenile detention centers. So I think there are places right here at Northwestern that we could likely support. The Northwestern Prison Education Program, all of these places are doing extraordinary work.
thank you so much. I'll make sure to send out all the links and all the organizations and literature that you mentioned during your talk. I'll send that out to the participants. Thank you for everyone that joined today. I know, at least from our center, we want to encourage everyone that is able to make sure they have a plan to vote this season, and to encourage and support their family and friends to vote. And it's also very important that everyone get their flu shots. So those are a few announcements.
I got mine day before yesterday.
Good job. See, so we want to make sure that people are involved, and just stay tuned. We will have more programming in the upcoming weeks. So thank you all. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.